Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our newest launch for Matthew Tétreault's Hold Your Tongue, a beautiful book, which we are very excited to be celebrating this evening. We are lucky enough to be joined by guests Kaitlyn Purcell and Uche, Peter, Umezurike, sorry, Umezurike. I apologize, Uche. We're going to do some readings and have some Q&As, and it's going to be wonderful. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat directed either to everyone or to Carolina or myself specifically. For the Q&A at the end, we would just ask that you put questions directed either to Carolina or myself, and then we will read them out to each of the readers. But we are going to begin. If Carolina, you think that's okay? We're happy to begin. Excellent. First of all, I'm going to pass it off to Mika from Audreys.
Yes, good evening, folks. I hope you're all having a wonderful day and not suffering too much from the heat. I know not everyone is joining in from Edmonton, for the folks who are, but it's extremely hot here today. But yes, so my name is Mika. My pronouns are they, them. I am from Audreys Books. And for the folks who live in Edmonton, I'm just going to start with a little land acknowledgement. So for us at Audreys Books, we want to acknowledge that we're located in Umezurike on Treaty 6 territory and Métis Region 4, the traditional homelands of many Indigenous nations such as Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, Métis, and Inuit, who have lived on and cared for these lands since time immemorial, and whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community today. And so as we go through tonight's event, I will be putting in the link for each and every book from each author that will be presenting, where you can purchase them from our online website at audreys.ca. I'll share a little bit more throughout the event, just as I pop things into the chat. But for folks who aren't in Edmonton and can't access the store in person, we also offer a free delivery and shipping available as well. So I'll pop that into the chat right now, but I will just briefly pass things back over to Meredith just to give a formal introduction for our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Mika. So yes, we will have links in the chat to where you can purchase the book and all of the information about Audreys as a bookstore. But first, we are going to have some wonderful speakers and readers. So first we have the wonderful Kaitlyn Purcell. Kaitlyn Purcell is a Dene writer, artist, and member of the Writing Revolution in Place Creative Research Collective at the University of Alberta. Currently, she is an English PhD student with Creative and Critical Indigenous Studies at the University of Calgary. Her research centers arts and literature as theoretical practice, exploring gender, sexuality, and multi-modal creative productions, creative writing, visual, digital, and installation arts as praxis towards healing and resistance. Her debut novella was selected by guest judges C.A. Conrad and Anne Boyer as the winner of the 2018 Metatron Prize for Emerging Authors and was published in the fall of 2019. Everyone, please welcome Kaitlyn Purcell.
Thank you. Yes, I will be reading a little bit from Bezayene, and I might read some new stuff. I'm really excited to be here to celebrate Matthew and also to be here with Uche. Yeah. Okay, so this is called Portsmouth. Portsmouth sits just above the border between Alberta and the Northwest Territories. Dene, Métis, Dogrib, and the fur trade washed up on the Slave River, and some of the caribou eaters were sent here in the 60s. Canadian government whispered a strange lullaby, wanted their people all in one place and out of Alberta, burned down their homes so they couldn't turn back. A lullaby drowning in fiction. Instead of living off the land, they're living in a town with no running water and no paint on their houses, and children pushed into residential schools, poisoned families, and generations of family buried in Alberta while the rest of them were laid to rest in the Northwest. Sundays spent with the Creator, and the church can still hear the whispering and whistles down in the crypt. Now the town is torn and whole and smells like buffalo hide. Yeah, Fort Smith is where my mother is from. And so Badaine is kind of an amalgamation of my, I don't know, my imagined experience, like of what my mother went through leaving her community to go to Edmonton, and what my late sister went through also living on the streets of Edmonton when she was around in her late teen years. And yeah, I was also a mall rat. And so it's a bit of all of these worlds kind of blended together. This next piece is called Edmonton. A city that sits on the North Saskatchewan with histories of fort makers and Papa's Chase garden thieves and land stolen so that people today can sit in their $1 million homes while they look out their windows and say to themselves, "Isn't this pretty?" There are some parts of the city that they prefer to look away from. They look away from the migrating swarms of worn-out-looking folks east of city center, the black bags and shopping carts that swim upstream towards the bottle depot each day by the 6 o'clock closing. They look away at night when they walk beneath the white breast in the sky, and they look away while teens wander alleys selling mom's medicine cabinet. Look away while a crying teenager runs out of an apartment building with only a towel wrapped around her. Look away when a guy dressed in all black walks towards the bridge. Look away when the teenagers sneak out into the night with their black jean jackets and glowing green hair. Yeah. Yeah, I can't believe this was published in 2019. Now it's 2023. Been a whirlwind for sure. I wonder. I think I wanted to just read some of my, like a few pieces from my newer works in progress for my dissertation. I've been kind of contemplating or like working through remembering like my childhood, and so I've been focusing in on those stories and kind of processing my experience in academia, like through that, like this one's called Jurassic Park, 1993. My mom and her big belly and my dad take me to the theater for the first time ever. We get popcorn and pop. I get to sit between Dad and all the night lights. I like it a lot until it starts to get darker and rainy and the heavy footsteps. I try to curl deeper into the seat until the goat's legs fall onto the window and I freeze. I become the boy in the Jeep looking up through the glass at the T-Rex. I throw my hand and legs up in the air to stop the T-Rex from its 1,000-teeth face punching the glass to eat me. My dad throws his brown leather coat on me and I close my eyes. I think I was 2.5 when this happened. So it was my first movie ever. Yeah. I don't know what else I wanted to share, but I want something like a little light. I guess there's also a part of it is like my my work with archived materials, which were kind of funny to look through. Like my parents both dropped off all of my childhood belongings, like, I don't know, a couple summers ago. And so one of them is a journal I wrote to Mrs. Modesty when I was around 9 years old. So this is kind of a segment from that. Dear Mrs. Modesty, my report card was great. Yes, I was surprised I got an A on LA because I hardly get an A on this subject. No, I didn't expect an A on LA. I want to improve on science and math. In behavior, I'm pretty good, so I just keep on behaving. On spring break, we're going to the movie Fantasia 2000, swimming. When I grow up, I want to be an artist because I always get A's in art and I really enjoy painting and drawing. Another reason is because my sister Lori is an artist that drew a famous picture, and she wrote a poem called The Red Tear. I want to be just like her. So yeah, I guess that's all I want to share right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. That was amazing. I especially liked the Jurassic Park. My father is a huge fan of Jurassic Park, as many people are. Next, we would like to welcome Uche Peter Umezurike to the stage. Uche is an assistant professor in the Department of English, University of Calgary, Canada. His teaching and research interests include African and African diaspora literatures, post-colonial literatures, gender and sexuality, cultural studies, and creative writing. Umezurike is the author of creative works such as There's More, Poetry 2023, Double Wahala, Double Trouble, Short Stories 2021, and Wishmaker, Children's Novel 2021. Please welcome Uche.
Thank you very much, Meredith. Am I clear enough? Loud enough?
You sound perfect to me.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Kaitlyn, for that wonderful reading. So honored to be sharing this space with Kaitlyn and Matt, two friends I've known since my PhD years in Edmonton, and I've been fortunate to really learn from them and then see the world from their own perspective. So I really appreciate that. And thank you, Carol, for organizing this. So I'm going to read from There Is More. And most of the poems here were inspired by stories about home, migration, exile, diaspora, but particularly migrants drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, dying along the Sahara deserts, and also this collection is my way of thinking about borders and citizenship and kinship and communities. So I'm just gonna read 2 or 3 poems. The first one is titled Body of Bones. At least, migrants died in multiple shipwrecks off the coast of eyes they don't see. This body of bones tell, nose they don't smell, tails of bones, nostrils they don't smell, bones adrift, bones ashore, bones under sea. Mouth they don't speak, bones breaking news, news breaking bones, bearing histories. Hands they don't feel, bodies that the water don't keep, bones the water keep, bones turn into silt, bones return into worms. Who's to blame for the bones that not see, that not hear, that not smell, that not speak, that not feel? The sea, its hunger, deep enough. The land, its hunger, deep enough. The boat, its hunger, deep enough. Families on the shore, their hunger, they hunger deep as the ocean. So the next poem is titled, The Sea is the Bridge. The sea is the bridge between home and horizon. The boat is 2 lips locked in prayer, trailing desire. The moon skims the bodies, gleaming like fish. The sea tucks her arms around bodies the boat has shed. The sea the boats, the moon, the bodies. There are fish bones in stories we do not share. Then the last poem is titled, The Sea Grows Its Circle of Bones. The sea grows its circle of stones and relics. The sea grows a stomach, bloated with plastic and rayon. The clam knows the shock of plunder. We'll live in a history of shells and bones, where a frontier is an epic of plunder. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And that was from, well, do we have links to the works of the other, of Kaitlyn and Uche, Carolina, that we could put in the chat possibly?
We do.
Excellent. She's so ahead of it. Carolina, who organized this entire event, is very on top of it. So before I introduce our headliner, I just want to give a brief rundown of Hold Your Tongue. So Hold Your Tongue, which is the debut novel of Matthew Tétreault from New West Press, asks what it means to be Métis and Francophone. Matthew Tétreault's debut novel shines with a poignant but playful character-driven meditation on the struggles of holding onto la langue and marks the emergence of an important new voice in Canadian literature. I know I'm biased, but it is a fabulous book, absolutely fabulous. And so I would like to introduce Matthew Tétreault, pronouns he, him. Matthew is a French Canadian and I messed up the beginning, I apologize. Matthew Tétreault is Métis and French Canadian from St. Anne, Manitoba. He is author of What Happened on the Blood Vein, Pemmican Publications 2015, a dark but humorous collection of interrelated short stories set in southeastern Manitoba. Matt holds a PhD in Métis literature and literary history from the University of Alberta, which is a common theme in this group. And he received a Governor General's Gold Medal for academic excellence. His dissertation traces the literary history of the Red River Métis. In between academic and creative writing projects, Matt plays guitar, video games, and poker for pocket change. He recently moonlighted as the farm boss on his in-laws' ranch in St. Ambrose, where he, his wife, daughter, and their old cat, Major Tom, which I think is one of my favorite cat names, landed upon their return to Manitoba. Hold Your Tongue is his first novel. He lives in Winnipeg. Please welcome Matthew Tétreault.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Meredith. Much appreciated. And thank you very much, Carolina, for organizing the event and everyone for attending today. Thank you especially Uche and Kaitlyn for attending, for sharing the space with me today. It's very much appreciated. It's great to see you again today. So yeah, I hope we have a really good conversation afterwards. Yeah, so Hold Your Tongue it's a novel exploring Francophone Métis experiences in Southeast Manitoba. And I thought I'd read part of a chapter on the protagonist's sister, his experiences interacting with his sister and his great uncle. Just to give you a bit of a taste of the country life. So this is a chapter titled A Tongue Sharp Enough to Pierce Leather. The revenge of the cradle only works if folks stick around, said Manik. Otherwise, what's the point? You're just creating more enemies, say. We stood in the shadows outside Alfred's cabin, sharing a cigarette, and Manik was getting riled up, like she always did, whenever we somehow ended up talking about politics and language or whatever. Seemed she was always bringing them up too, since she had gotten that computer and started reading things over the dial-up. She went from listening to Rage Against the Machine and reading Adbusters magazines, trawling the web, quoting from some royal commission and spitting fire about Métis history. I tried to steer clear whenever she confronted our parents about their lack of knowledge. You've never heard of scrip? She would yell at the dinner table. She had come by that evening to drop off some clothes and deliver a message. Mom's disappointed, she said, and laughed as I grabbed the bag of clothes and tossed it onto the small cot that Alfred had set up for me. Alfred invited her inside and Manik stayed for supper. We sat at the kitchen table and peeled potatoes while Alfred fetched deer sausage from the chest freezer. He had been quiet since we returned from canoeing, and so I was glad Monique had decided to stay for a while. It was funny watching her work. She seemed so out of place in Alfred's cabin, decked out in a Che Guevara t-shirt and punk-patched jean jacket with a short-cheered purple hair and a nose stud. She clashed with the stuffed deer on the wall. With that knife in her hand, she seemed more likely to stab someone rather than peel potatoes. But when she got it into her head to do something, she did it with every ounce of her being. Flayed potato skin rained onto the table. After skinning a half dozen apples of the earth, Monique looked up at me. So, she said, what happened? I don't want to talk about it. I heard you broke Martin Chaput's nose. It was an accident. Weren't you fighting? Well, yeah, but I didn't want to break his nose. Second nose you break this year, she said. Alfred slipped into the kitchen carrying an oversized Ziploc bag full of sausage. He placed the bag on the counter, then began rummaging through the cupboards for a frying pan. I was just trying to drive him back, make him stop talking. I guess his nose got in the way. Monique nodded. Should have kneed him in the balls. Quick thrust, comme ça, she said, and yanked her fist down. She fired her knee upwards. He would have gone down fast. That's not how men fight, I scoffed. She lifted her eyebrows and scoffed back at me. You mean smart? Alfred chuckled and I dropped my eyes on the table. Monique had taken taekwondo lessons in Umezurike, and for a while she'd relished the opportunity to test her skills on unsuspecting school bullies. She once goaded Justin Leclerc into throwing a punch at her, then knocked his clumsy blow aside and dropped him with a quick leg sweep. Although everyone knew she had goaded him, Monique was a straight-A student, a bright star in a dim field, an exasperated teacher once said. And so the principal gave her a half-day in-school suspension while Justin Leclerc was sent home for the rest of the week. Qu'est-ce qu'il a dit? Alfred said, lifting himself from the ground and placing a cast-iron frying pan on the stove. He limped over to the table and sat across from me. Monique tossed the potatoes into the pot. Alfred grabbed his tea. He always kept a mug of tea at his fingertips, and he took a quiet sip. Ben, he said afterwards. Qu'est-ce qu'il a dit? Qui ça? Alfred sipped his tea and he seemed to disappear for a moment, hidden behind an old camouflaged ball cap, tinted eyeglasses, and his mug. Monique glanced between us. Le gars qui t'a cassé son nez, said Alfred. Mais non, I said. I don't know if I... Geez, Rich, Monique snapped. Just tell... Alfred gently touched her arm and she grew quiet. Then he turned to me again and after a long moment nodded. Une fois que t'es prêt, he said. He placed his tea down, pressed his hands on the table and lifted himself out of his chair. Monique brought the potatoes to the stove. Once the potatoes started boiling, Alfred dumped the sausage into the frying pan. We ate quietly, listening to Alfred explain how he'd harvested the deer, where he'd seen it, how he'd stalked it, how he shot it. Apparently, La Biche had been coming around the cabin all summer, eating his plants. The flowers he grew in the stopped-up tops of old milk cans and in the silk trays that hung beneath the small windows. He grew herbs, garnishes, medicines, he said, and La Biche had gotten into them and had taken a bite out of a couple of the plants. The flowers were one thing. It hadn't much bothered Alfred that they'd ended up in the deer's stomach, but the herbs were another matter. I can taste the rosemary, said Monique. Alfred chuckled. Then he grew serious again and explained how he set about hunting the deer. He plonked himself by the window, rifle by his side, and waited pour que la biche revienne. Drette là, he said, pointing with a fork to the small window by the doorway. At first he had watched her out of the corner of his eye as she breached the tree line not far from the cabin. La biche meandered through the yard, its ears rigid, flicking back and forth and scanning for sound. Dipping her head into a bucket, she tasted and drank still water. She ambled over to a bunch of weeds sprouting to an old rusted farm tractor that Alfred had set out as a decoration. La biche stood there and chewed for a while before retreating into the forest. Day after day, Alfred watched her come and go. Nearly a week passed before she stood centered in the window. In the early evening, as light came through the clouds and the leafy tips of birch and ash trees, Alfred saw her. With the smell of rain in the air, the stink of mulch rising from the tray on the windowsill, Alfred lifted his rifle and brought the sight up to his eye. Bang! Alfred shouted, slapping the table. Monique squeaked and I choked on my food. The deer tumbled, then righted herself and dashed into the woods. Mais je savais que je l'avais eu. Because it almost fell over, I said. Mais ça, oui, Alfred said and laughed. Puis le paquet de sang par terre et tout. La biche didn't make it far. Alfred followed the deer to the bush, trailing the snapped branches and splotches of blood on the leaves and in the grass. When he came upon her under an old maple tree, la biche était morte. So he set about bleeding her carcass. The next problem was finding a butcher in the middle of summer. Mais ça, said Alfred, c'est une autre histoire. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I love Monique. She's an excellent sister. So we will now open up to questions. What I think, Carolina, please correct me if this is not what you envisioned. But I'm thinking I would like to invite all three of our wonderful speakers. Unless we, yeah, exactly. Colby, you've got it. So we've got a question from Colby, who says, I would like to ask a question to Uche and Matthew. I know Uche studies masculinity, particularly African or Nigerian masculinity. I wonder if Uche and Matthew could talk about the differences and similarities in masculinity in their cultures, and maybe how colonialism/imperialism has affected that. An easy question to start.
That's a PhD defense question. I was thinking we're gonna get like softer questions. I'm just wrestling with the flu, and now you just wanna like aggravate my condition. Matt, you can go ahead and have a bite at that while I gather my thoughts together.
Sure, I'll think a little bit. I'll think on my feet here. That is a tough question. That's a huge question. Masculinities and how it's been affected by colonialism. Yeah, that's such a complicated question, because it's also been affected by, I think, in terms of like the Métis in Southeast Manitoba anyways, interactions with the Catholic Church as well. And so, you know, if you look at Métis masculinities historically compared to what they are today, it's a whole different lifestyle. And so it's hard to even gauge how masculinities change when the economies and the conditions that people lived under changed. So, you know, like you think of like your prototypical like Métis masculinity kind of image from the 19th century, and you're probably thinking of like a buffalo hunter or maybe someone who's paddling a canoe or something, but those are not, you know, valid professions anymore. And so, you know, trading was also a big profession, so maybe there's some of that there. And so that, you know, there's also the tension between the church and probably First Nations communities who the Métis were related to, that probably had more matriarchal kind of systems. Changes the way that men are also perceived and their roles in communities and whatnot. Yeah, that's such a large question. I really don't know where to go with that. I think what I've, I guess, explored through the protagonist's journey in the novel is really his place in the world, and not in terms of a man so much, but just as a person, understanding himself in relation to place, in relation to language and culture. And his journey takes a different path than his sister's journey, for instance. So in the novel, the protagonist, Richard, he's kind of stuck in his hometown, stuck in these sort of dead-end jobs. And he's wondering what his place is there, what it means to be from there, whether or not he wants to move on or stay, how culture kind of relates to that. But then his sister Manik, who I just read about, she's much more fiery than him. Where Richard, the protagonist, is very laissez-faire, sort of going with the flow, doesn't appear to be very ambitious. Manik is the direct opposite. She moved away when she's 18. She goes to university. She is reading up on history. She's very invigorated in reconnecting, the recovery of culture and language, and in pushing that forward, where Richard is less so. I don't want to paint that as a general, these are more female women's experiences for Manik, and then for Richard it's more male experience. But I think there might be something to be said about how a lot of organizing, a lot of political organizing, cultural organizing is led by Métis women. Historically, through like Maria Campbell, and you see these movements kind of happen. And so, yeah, there is a bit of an equality where there's people, both men and women, who are pushing for that recovery. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's such a complicated question. I do appreciate it. I think I'll pass the baton to Uche, and maybe we can think more about it.
Yeah, so thank you. Okay, I'll mute myself. Yeah, okay, so thank you, Kobe. So the way I'm going to respond to this, because I don't want to go too much into historical account of how colonialism reshaped a gender system in Nigeria, or particularly in the Southeast where I'm from, because I can speak for the other parts of Nigeria. So one way to look at it is to use a novel like Things Fall Apart, written by Chinua Achebe. Written by Chinua Achebe. And so in that novel, you have different performances or understandings of masculinities. And so you have someone like Okonkwo, who has a rigid notion of what it means to be a man. And then you have his friend, Umezurike, who was more, sorry, just give me a second, just a second.
I wonder if maybe Colby's question came from the comment that Monique made about, what did she say? Boys don't fight smart. Is that which I'm not arguing it's true. I'm just quoting the book. Oh yeah.
No,
Yeah. Sorry for that. So in that novel, you had different ideas of what it's meant to be a man in pre-colonial Nigeria / colonial period. And so what I can say for a fact is that colonialism really reshaped not just gender ideas or how people performed femininity or masculinity, but also culture, the economic system. And so, and when you think about the Victorian ideas or ideals of how to be a woman in terms of propriety or decorum or etiquette, and some of these ideas filtered to for instance, the Igbo gender system in Nigeria, and men were supposed to be monogamous. And so there was this kind of rigid adherence to monogamy, and which was, well, a British system of looking at the world, because then these were not really clear cuts in the pre-colonial / colonial period, where people could a woman could decide to marry another woman based on certain arrangements. And I think there's this scholar who did something about I think the Nobi culture in Anambra State, forgotten her name, just escaped my head. And then this other woman also who did something in the Southwest, I think, Oyewonke. And I've just forgot. So before what the argument there is that then the system was more fluid. It was more receptive to different ideas of gender. But with the coming of colonialism, there was a sort of formalizing and regulatory mechanism that shaped people into, Ife Amadume's book. And so there was more fluidity during that period before colonialism came and reshaped how people were supposed to think in terms of marriage, kinship, masculinity and femininity. So that's the much I can say. But it's a very compelling question and gives so much opening to really think about how gender has really changed from the pre-colonial to colonial and then to this period, which is more or less my own focus, contemporary definitions of masculinities in Nigerian literature. Thank you, Kobe.
Thank you both. Those were wonderful answers to a very complex question. I do think it's interesting that you both drew analogies of economics in some way or another. Which, yeah. Kaitlyn, did you have, you don't, no pressure, but if you had a response, you're very welcome.
Sorry, what was that?
If you have anything you'd like to throw in, you're very welcome, but no worries if not.
Yeah, masculinities, I'm just like, I don't know, we're all suffering under, I don't know.
The
Yeah,
patriarchy.
yeah, we all suffer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is very true.
Yeah.
If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, but never fear. Oh, yes.
I think Kaitlyn has a question from Tom.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, sorry. Oh my goodness. Tom, apologies, Tom. So Tom is asking, Kaitlyn, I'm curious to learn more about the archive of childhood stuff you got from your parents and how it worked its way into your writing, if that's something you're okay with talking about. As a writer, I find it fascinating to re-encounter myself from decades ago. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, Tom.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Yeah, it was an interesting experience receiving all of these, like the archives of my childhood. And then it was around that time when there was a professor at the university that reached out to me to take on this position as a research assistant in the archives of Marvin Francis University of Manitoba. So it was weird, kind of like the synchronicity of like having all of these archives and then, I don't know, kind of diving into this space of, I don't know, archivist studies, which for the longest time, whenever, I don't know, anyone brought up archives in university, I was like, oh, it's like, I don't know, I like a lot of things in university, I'm like, oh, it's for like, how to put this, people not like me, I don't know, like white people, or I don't know, just like kind of like a weird, like internalized thing, like issue I have. And, you know, feeling like things are too academic for me, I guess. But yeah, so it was kind of cool getting to experience, I don't know, working through my archives and then like seeing the academic side of this process of going into the archives and like seeing, I don't know, the library and all the archives of this poet. So yeah, but so I don't know, it seemed like very important. And then in the process of kind of working through my dissertation, and I originally had this big idea, and then I kind of like, I wanted to write memoirs based on like my whole life. And then I had to cut it down to the childhood experiences. So that's where kind of the archives and those memories kind of, I don't know, took the front stage. But it was just also really funny and fun. I don't know, it's also kind of weird because it's like very connected to grief and grieving and like the afterlife and death and all these things. But the experience was kind of hilarious, like seeing like there's my mom kept a late slip from grade 4. And my reason for being late was that I was watching my nephew while my mom had a smoke. And I used that reason twice, which was kind of funny to me. So I don't know, I've kind of been working through, I don't know, just all of that. And yeah, there's also some stories I wrote when I was in grade 7 and 9, which were horrifying to read, but also hilarious. And how sad they were. Yeah, it's been an experience. I don't know what else I can add, but thanks for the question.
Sounds like a very interesting experience, though. I'll just give everyone a second. If not, I have not an emergency question. I have a question of my own. Okay, I'm going to ask a question if that's okay. My question's for Matthew. Lovely Matt. And I was hoping you want to talk a little bit about your author's note in the book and your notion of translation through context, which I love the idea of. So, and maybe about language in the book a little bit more, which you can definitely talk about way better than I can.
Sure, yeah. I just had to quickly flip over and reread my author's note to see what I wrote. Yeah, the language really is like a large part of what I'm trying to do in the book. Is really kind of represent the linguistic and cultural complexities of around where I grew up. There's French Canadian, there's French Michif, there's you come to Winnipeg, there's some more standard like international types of French. And so there's like really like a multilingualism that's kind of happening in the area among the many other languages that are also being spoken. And so to try to capture some of that and put that in the book is something that I wanted to do. But then how to do that and how to do that in a way that doesn't get bogged down through always providing a translation was a challenge that I had to like work through early on. And then I just settled on the idea of giving no translation whatsoever, just inserting the languages into the book, and then shaping the scenes around the use of languages through enough context that someone who doesn't understand, read French, speak French, whatnot, or maybe someone who perhaps speaks French but doesn't really get the French Michif would still be able to figure out what's going on. And so you're still able to access the story. But what I find that is interesting is it does create these slight layers, like these slight barriers where something is not quite accessible to everyone. And I think that's okay. Because what I've seen, for instance, so far is like people from the region, people from St. Anne who've read the book, they really enjoy it. They really like it. And I think to see themselves represented in that way is really good. And I know that people don't understand all the time, the complexities of like that area, because there's linguistic barriers, cultural barriers, and whatnot. But the idea that not everything is necessarily for everyone is a cool idea. I like playing with that and putting that right in the book. I mean that goes for many cultures, right? There's ceremonies, there's things, there's stories that are just for the people from that culture. Well, how do we do that with language in a book? And so I just playing around with that a little bit, and issuing a bit of a challenge too to Anglophone readers, like meet me halfway. These are realities of Western Canada. There are languages other than English present here, and so can we meet halfway and still understand each other?
Oh, goodness. I agree with what Tom has added to the chat. It is hugely important. And there's also some very good layers of, there's a joke at one scene, which I'm not going to tell the joke because it kind of spoils. But there's a joke, which is a joke for people who do not understand any French, because it's like a punchline if you don't get any of the French. But if you do, you already sort of know what's happening. it's very interesting, but I feel like this question, not in the specificity of the author's note, but in the idea of language and bringing languages into work can be extended to Uche and Kaitlyn, if you have anything you'd like to talk about in that as well, if you want.
Yeah, Kaitlyn, do you want to go first?
Oh, if you want me to, but I know language revitalization is, I know it's really empowering, and I appreciate like all the different ways that I've like, I don't know, the different ways that other writers kind of play with including kind of, I don't know, italicized or not italicized or like emphasized or like footnotes or endnotes or a glossary or whatnot. Yeah, I'm also kind of trying to think, like when I published Badaillone, I initially had the title just, or like the translation, not anywhere in the book, but then the second edition, I was like, oh, whatever, what the heck, I'm going to include it. So I don't know, it's just kind of, there's like no like wrong or right way. It's just all kind of, I don't know, I like seeing the different ways that seem to feel right. I think I appreciate the text where it's not emphasized and it's just kind of a part of the text and you kind of have to translate it yourself. Yeah, I appreciate those moments. So I'm looking forward to reading Hold Your Tongue. So, see.
Yeah. So I think for someone like me, an African Canadian, and someone who is from a colonized nation, I think language has always been something I struggle with, and of late I've been thinking about language as a kind of border, the way it's not only defines and delimits your interaction with people or even the kind of relationship you can forge across different borders, whether it's ethnicity, sex, gender, sexuality, or even race. And so just this morning I was thinking about language in terms of, because there's a poem I read about a Somali refugee who the first word when she met the customs officer was, so there's this conversation, the custom officer asks her name and she says a refugee. And so at that moment, it really struck me that, because the poet says, oh, that's the first English word that woman has ever spoken. And so for me, it really complicates how we think about language in terms of how it constitutes identity or even constitutes how we recognize someone. And so for this Somali woman who refuses to say her real name, her native name, her family name, and then instead says her name is a refugee or just refugee. So how does that begin to question what it means to be able to speak in English, to speak in a language that is the language of the state or the English nation? And so for me, I think it's, as a poet, I grapple with that. As a creative writer, as a critical scholar, I'm always thinking about language. How can we like trouble this notion that there's a particular way of speaking English? Like if you don't speak this English, it's cast you as someone who perhaps is the other in whatever way we decide to see that person. And so maybe because I'm really thinking about how language is linked to perceptions and identities, particularly for those who come across the border in a way to recreate a sense of home on someone else's land, for instance, indigenous people of Canada or the United States. So I'm at a point where I'm thinking more about the political character of language rather than just using language as a tool to express certain impressions or certain feelings, or even just to articulate my own sense of the world. And I think that's just the much I can say for now, thinking about language in its very political character.
We've not chosen very easy, quick answer questions, have we? Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, so I will begin to wrap things up. But before I pass things back to Mika, so we can talk again about Audreys just a little bit and where we can get the book, the last question I'd like to ask the three of you is, do you have any new work that you would, well, Matthew, obviously, like this is your new work, but even beyond that, any other work that you would like to reference before we go? If you don't, that's completely fine too. Okay. Oh,
I can talk a little bit about what I'm working on.
that was kind of what I was hoping, just a little.
Yeah, I got a grant this winter to do. I pitched a Métis literary western and a war novel set in the 19th century. And so I've been starting to work on that a little bit. And like this novel, like Hold Your Tongue, there's a lot of research needed for it. I want to try to capture a lot of the culture, the ways of life, economic conditions, territory, through where the characters are going to be traveling. It's set south of the US-Canada border in North Dakota. And so I really want to try to show Métis experiences south of the US-Canada border, because that's not something that really appears that often in Métis literature. And also kind of, before the really concretization of that US-Canada border, when it was much more fluid, right? It was still part of like the Métis territory. And then when the Métis were brushing up against First Nations south of the US, their interactions with the Dakota, the Mandan, whatnot. And so kind of exploring that a little bit more, and then pushing the language even more. So the way that I play with language in Hold Your Tongue and include a lot of French, well, I want to try to do that with this historical novel as well, but not just French Michif, but Anishinaabe and Cree and other languages, to try to make it like a really multilingual text, which is going to be difficult to do. But I think it's necessary. I mean, historically, most Métis people spoke like 4, 5, 6 languages, and so to represent them only through one language or 3 languages seems like a disservice. And so to really capture, the 19th century, I think I have to do a deep dive into that aspect of things. And then, I get to learn as well, which is what's so fun about doing the research for these types of things. Yeah, I'll just leave it at
that project sounds very cool. Okay, thank you all so much. Before we go, I'm just going to pass it quickly back to Mika to give us a closing statement from closing statement. That sounded very intense. Goodbye remarks from Audreys.
Hey, thank you so much, everyone. That was so wonderful to listen to everyone speak and answer all those questions. I've just attached a link again in the chat for our website, Audreys, where you can buy all the books from tonight's events. For folks who live in Edmonton, I recognize a few folks here who are regular customers at our store. So a few of you are pretty familiar with how our store works, but if you live in Edmonton, you can just reserve them for pickup. Or if you prefer, we also have free delivery options. Or if you're outside of Edmonton, we also have shipping available as well. It's pretty standard. It's just a simple buying online kind of thing. But if you have any questions, feel free to message me as well. I'll also be here until the end of the event. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tamika, for joining us. Thank you to the wonderful Carolina, US marketing coordinator, for organizing everything. Thank you to Kaitlyn. Thank you to Uche. And thank you so much, Matthew. This was wonderful. It was a great way to celebrate. Have a lovely evening, everyone.